Justin, welcome to our podcast. Very happy to have you.
Great, thanks very much for inviting me to come and join the memory team.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Tell us a bit more about yourself and what's led you to this point.
Well, my background is academic and practitioner background or pracademic background has been human-centered design. Okay, so I'm relatively new to what would be called, I don't know, AEC industries or built environment. And I was actually headhunted by one of the tier one main contractors, but actually never ended up getting to the interview because before getting to the interview, I was hired to give some consultancy to someone in the sort of technology space. And that was really around smart buildings, and spent about 8 months really kind of trying to do what in my previous life would have been called a deep dive into the space, and really looking at it as a kind of wicked problem, because there's no one size fit all solutions for smart buildings. And also seeing this space as being, or a space, but more like an ecosystem with lots of multiple stakeholders, all with very different perspectives and very multiple different relationships within that space. I often use this kind of the parable of the 6 blind men and the elephants to describe ecosystems, and I thought smart buildings was very much like that, because in this parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant, each one of them bumps into a different part of the elephant and think they discovered something else. So one who bumps into the leg thinks it's a tree trunk, the one who touches a tusk thinks it's a spear, the one who touches the trunk thinks it's a python, and so on and so on. And it's, for me, what I'd noticed in the smart building space is something similar, because everyone sort of looks at it from their particular perspective and then tries to map that on to their experience of the space. So if you're in BMS, you see smart buildings as being BMS. If you're on kind of employee experience, you see it as hybrid working technologies. If you're someone who's responsible for tenants, you're someone who talks about tenants experience. So everyone has these there are all these multiple perspectives looking at the same thing. And what hasn't really happened, I'm not saying it's necessarily me, is someone to say, look, how do we facilitate some discussion which shows each other those different perspectives? Because there are lots of disconnects. And I suppose the most important disconnect would be like the one between those who specify and help make smart buildings happen and those who have to operate them. So a lot of the reason to look at that is to think, what is the real problem that needs to be solved here? Is it to just make a building smart, at practical completion? Or is it about how a building is smart because of the way it is actually run while it's in use? So that was kind of how I ended up in that space, what I've been doing. And subsequently to that, I've been sort of helping different stakeholders try and get a better understanding of all those different perspectives. And often by facilitating things like gatherings, roundtables, where they have an opportunity to try and put their different perspectives on the table and get a better understanding of how the other people see this, particularly those people who are on IT and those people like developer, owner, operators who have to who are involved in the commissioning of projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've highlighted some big problems there, and ones that would ideally, we would love to solve in the smart building industry. So I think definitely you've hit on something, and I know you have. And how I came across you on LinkedIn was your work talking about retrofit, and how that can get ignored in this sort of whole, race or drive to net zero, and the new sustainability agenda. So, I mean, how are you viewing that at the moment? What is sort of your view on retrofit and why it's being slightly
back to sorry, it's slightly back to my origin story, because one of the reasons I became fascinated in this space is before coming into this space, I was in where sustainability met marketing, and I was helping the International Advertising Association connect with all the other organizations in that space who had some kind of sustainability or diversity initiative, so that they might help foster collaboration between them, because otherwise all those different um, all those different initiatives were becoming fragmented and the whole wasn't greater than the sum of the parts. So coming into this space, I was really fascinated because I thought, well, actually, unlike that space, I can see how a tangible difference can be made, because, we've all seen the stats about, emissions in operations. 75% of buildings aren't energy efficient.
Mm-hmm.
80% of buildings that are in use today are going to be still in use in 2050. So if there's a space that one could really make a tangible difference as far as drive towards net zero, where is it? Well,
Mm-hmm.
it struck me looking at all those stats. Let's start with buildings, because they represent, whatever it is, 30 to 40% of all emissions, etc. So that's where I came into that space. In terms of why there isn't as much
Mm-hmm.
around retrofit, I think, and this, I'm sorry if I start to sound very Marxist here, but it's because follow the money. And I think until
Mm-hmm.
recently, interest rates have been very low. So the big focus has been around new builds, because, you know, borrowing was cheap. You could get a good return from property in
Mm-hmm.
terms of rental income, etc. So that's where the focus was. It's also where a shed load of money can be made by anyone selling things into that space. Anyone selling operational technology, information technology, building and professional services, etc. So there was a lot of material there, and if you look at all the white papers, all the rating agencies have come out, that seemed to be where the focus is. But we're now seeing a shift, interest rates are going up. I was at a round table this morning organized by one of the tier one contractors. And, I asked a question, and because it was mostly full of architects and building consultants. And I said, what is the focus now for you? Is it more build, new build, or retrofit? Every single one of them said retrofit is now the most important area we're in. So
Okay.
I think partly why it hasn't happened as much before, because a lot of energy was being focused on new build.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now I think there is a focus on retrofit. The clock is ticking on drive towards net zero in 20, 30, 40, 50. So it's just about it being a time when people are going, we do need to focus on that. There's a shift in emphasis about what people are looking at to do with, their portfolios. I also think there's regulatory issues.
I was going
There's a,
to mention that. Do you think that
well,
the
there's,
sustainability reporting is
well,
having an
that
impact?
Well, that, and also, I mean, there's a famous supermarket, which I'm not going to mention, who didn't get planning permission to knock down a building on Oxford Street recently. Which means that their hand is being forced into retrofitting or refurbishment of it.
Mm.
And I think, that's just one example, which is, will probably be true of many others. But, particularly in city centres, it may become harder just to like decide to, get rid of a building.
No, indeed. I mean,
Uh,
I remember a example, another retailer, but not in supermarkets, but in another space. But again, they built a building which was perfectly acceptable. Then 15 years later, knocking it down to produce this new energy efficient
yeah.
building. It's like, well, if you take into account embodied carbon and all the other issues, then really was it worth it? And I guess that's an education piece as well, right? That
Well,
we need to have a better understanding of it.
I think the embodied carbon thing is becoming more and more. I mean, if we look historically at smart buildings, and one of the people I've been co-facilitating these round tables with is an ex-Arup smart building technologist who's been around since the mid 90s, he was saying, at the beginning, it was really all about energy.
Mm.
Okay. Now things have changed. It's not just about energy, it's about sustainability, it's about,
Mm-hmm.
health and well-being, it's about tenant experience, user experience, and a whole load of other things, which increases the complexity in terms of the numbers of stakeholders involved. But certainly, the sustainability piece, or ESG, is becoming, increasingly important. So I think there have been shifts all the way along, and I think employers will probably have a contribution to that. Can we really justify that we're going to build to new buildings because it's going to be like this? Um, recruiting the next generation of the workforce might become more problematic if they think, there's been all this investment on this side of things rather than on that
Mm.
side of things. So there's lots of factors there. But one of the interesting things which did come out of the roundtable that we recently co-facilitated with some of the sort of top developer owner operators in the UK was, they huge consensus, but the driver was sustainability rather than the offering of more services as far as retrofit is
Mm.
concerned,
Mm.
and the role that smart has to play in bringing that about. So that's certainly which has been the kind of hook for me to kind of dig deeper into
Mm.
this. But I think that as an industry as a whole, that was true, and certainly the broader event I was at this morning, but the roundtable this morning was just part of. I mean, that is all about sustainable construction, better, whether that's for new build or retrofit. So smart to me just seems to be the other side of the coin. One is about the making of repurposing of buildings, and the other is about how they are operated better.
Mm. Yeah, because I mean, listening to you talk there reminded me of your little parable at the start, right, about perspectives. Do you get a sense that the people, the architects, the consultants, their perspective on smart, on energy use optimization, the actual in use part of it, do they understand that well enough?
Well, I don't want to be the opposite of Dale Carnegie and sort of alienate, so make friends and alienate people, and lose friends and alienate people. But I, the biggest problem that came out, not today, well, it was even talked about today as well. So I mean, I was glad that some of the key themes from the roundtable that I co-facilitated, and the one that I attended today, were pretty much identical in terms of what they were talking about. And there is a massive disconnect, it seems, between those who have to end up operating the buildings and those who are involved in the buildings that those people end up having to
Mm-hmm.
operate.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's the so I don't know if it's about them necessarily being ahead or behind. It's just about the different kind of conversations going on. And what wasn't necessarily pointed out today as clearly, or that it was touched upon, is but there's often a skills gap. It's like
Mm-hmm.
an expectation. Once you start talking about data, you need data analysts. The
Mm.
person who used to go around just doing the maintenance of the HVAC and all of whatever other operational technology in the buildings isn't necessarily the person who's going to be able to kind of look at what the data is showing and do something about it, let alone automate the doing of something about it. So it's all very well, and I think so. Is it they're behind? Is it, or is it about the technology has got increased so much, but you could specify some sort of, maybe not the TARDIS, but potentially the holodeck or something kind of equivalent of advanced technology, but that doesn't necessarily going to mean that you're going to have the people who can then
No,
use
absolutely. Yeah.
use it. So that piece, I think, is still the missing bit. So you can make a building smart ready, connect it up, whether that's using enterprise networking technology, or in retrofit there's other ways to be able to get
Mm.
data around.
Mm.
Like today I met some people who are using radio, because it goes better through insulation and
Mm-hmm.
walls
Mm-hmm.
than using Wi-Fi or whatever.
Mm.
So there's lots of ways you can do that, but ultimately the bit that still needs to come up to speed as those people are going to be operating it, understanding what the data is telling them, what they can do about it. And I think that's where the real learning, is going, that upgrade, plugging that skills gap is going to be the
No,
thing that really
absolutely
needs to be
critical.
concentrated.
Yeah, and I agree. Bringing, and then again, it's the education and having those skills in the right place, all of those issues as well. I wanted to ask you about something. I read an article that you wrote, and this was a quote that stood out for me. So it said, if the net zero yearly energy consumption target that we've kind of set ourselves, right, is 55 kilowatts per meter squared, and the current average is around 160 kilowatts, with best in class being 110. So basically, at the moment, a good building is 110 kilowatts of energy used per meter squared. I mean, how likely are we to meet these targets anyway, these net zero targets by 2050?
Well, I mean, it's not looking good, is what I would say. But, I don't really want to be a doom, merchant about this. I mean, and even the person who quoted those stats, which is Dr. Matthew Marsden
Mm-hmm.
at JLL, saying there are things we can be doing, but it's about, I suppose for me, is it's very easy to get kind of, excited or caught like a bunny in headlamps about, talking about photovoltaics, changing all your your BMS systems and all of those. But there are some things that can be
Yeah,
done straight away, which can
that
make a big dent. And I think
that
that's
kind of
probably
easy 30% of energy efficiency, right, which should be the
yeah, the
basically
low hanging fruit.
everyone's starting point.
Yeah, like before, we started this interview, we were starting to touch upon some of this.
Mm.
There are some. I guess this is it. Is quite a fragmented industry. The you know, AEC or whatever you want to call it, architecture, engineering, construction, and particularly if you start to bring in that, and that's evident by the multiple number of trade associations there are in it. Dealing with every single aspect from lighting alliance, is it DALI, through to IWFM for facilities managers, and SIBC and UK PropTech Association, so on and so on. So,
Mm-hmm.
but if we cannot collaborate as on this space, given how much emissions come from the built environment, we've really had it. So, like, if there is some way that we can get that thing kick-started with a catalyst, then I think it has to be that low-hanging fruit. And I know that so the people who offered the stat was actually a developer owner operator called Patricia, and I know that they have been working with Siemens in Germany
Mm-hmm.
around how they do look at that. I mean, one of the other participants in that panel was in that roundtable was British Land, and they have got some, like, you may have 20 systems in a full-blown smart building, but with retrofit you could zoom in on 5 different ones and really focus your efforts on those to get going. So
Right, because you again in that article you talked about the agility of retrofit, which I
yeah,
thought was interesting. Right, so these 5 key areas, essentially, what you should be if you want to get data. Though there are 5 sort of key areas or key systems that you could focus on if you were looking for somewhere to start and say, actually, I want some data to do this.
if it's drive towards net zero, not necessarily if it's like for health and well-being or productivity
For
on
sure.
hybrid
Yeah.
working.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you're looking at it in a sustainability
Mm-hmm.
lens, that seems to be the case, and that is also linked to the other stat about 30% of your savings can be made with just some simple, better monitoring of all your HVAC
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
systems and how you turn, you know,
And
making sure
so
you turn lights off, making fan coils aren't on when people aren't in that area of the building. All
right.
of those really simple things can drive massive reductions. Now, if people can start on doing that and sharing their I mean, that's the thing I'm really getting at, is if people can share their understandings and learning of that, then there is some hope that, yes, we can start bringing down those numbers, given that the best in class is like double what
What
the
it should
number
be,
that we're
what we need it to
what it
be.
should
Yeah.
what it needed to be. So at least we can start bringing that down. But
And what
without
were
that
those 5
collaboration piece,
systems that were referred to as being the
well,
one?
off the top of my head, I have to remember, but it's going to be lighting. But if you look at any diagram of smart buildings when they have operational technology,
Yeah.
I'm pretty certain it's the same ones of those.
Yeah.
It's like,
Access control, I think, was one, wasn't it? Building
yeah,
management system.
yeah, BMS, lighting,
Mm.
fire, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all the ones which can be relatively high energy consumption, and and the HVAC being a major part of
Yeah.
that. So,
Yeah.
so whatever you can do to get better data from the building management system and start, using that to make data decisions.
Yeah, it is a point actually that I hear I've heard quite a few times about that. You actually like have a better understanding of what you have already. So you will probably have some base system. It might be old, but there'll be some data that you can get out of it. Maybe that's enough to do or to achieve what you want it to achieve. For example, access control. That system can give you some data on occupancy, whereas so perhaps you don't need to, install some new system for to measure occupancy in what would be a much more detailed way, but it might give you enough for what you
as a starting place. And I think so with that agility, I'd also talk about modularity too. So agility being some sort of feedback loop or action learning cycle, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the at the round table today, there was a roadmap presented, as a prototype or proto roadmap, but it did the two sides of it was a kind of infinity loop diagram,
Mm-hmm.
but the two bits joined up in the middle around data, measurement and performance. Starting with that, looking at that to see what you've got in place, then building that out to see where you've got to,
Mm-hmm.
and then coming back through the cycle again. So that's one thing. But I also thought, they were also talking about with modularity about, they call it MMC, I guess it is, which is the fabrication of things. Because bearing in mind, unless buildings are a certain age, trying to strip out or rewire them, etc., can be problematic. So anything sort of pre-early 90s, historic buildings, you may be limited or have to think more creatively about solutions. Hence, people talking about radio, using different form, using Wi-Fi rather than fiber or other things, because you don't have that. But with MMC, you might be able to put in new ceiling systems to be able to carry those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
If they're fabricated in factories to be deployed in the buildings and are using recycled materials or whatever,
Indeed,
then
yeah.
the deployment can be faster. And I think what you start to see is, and this is where my sort of human-centered design thing comes in, you start to see patterns that repeat themselves in certain building types, so that you can then, anyone doing the specification can then make things happen faster, basically.
Yeah, anything we can do to kind of be more auto or process driven, or in smart buildings, is too often they're treated as buildings that just unique, which they are, but anything we can do to create processes that we can repeat is hugely important, I think, for retrofit.
Well, also I think going back to this, why isn't there so much about retrofit? I mean, what has driven smart buildings recently is, and I won't say as who exactly said it, but they are one of those people whose buildings have got one of those high rated smart building certificates, said that a smart building is one which helps get the tenants in the fastest. So clearly what was driving that as a developer was being able to get tenants in at a high tenancy rate.
For sure, yeah.
Whereas I think with retrofit it's slightly different, whereby it might be more about trying to make sure that those buildings are run more efficiently. And yes, the upside might be that you could get better rental income for them than you would do if you just left it, because it isn't very sustainable. It's quite
Mm-hmm.
expensive to run. All of those other things which are ultimately going to get passed on to the tenants.
Yeah.
And to
Good.
the point that you are getting some facilities management companies talking about putting in platforms for free on the basis that they'll pay for it by the savings which are made by making them more efficient. So that the cost of making them more efficient isn't then passed on with increased rates to the tenants.
No, great, all good points, absolutely. Just to wrap up, Justin, what can
Sure.
we expect from you next? What are you how are you going to help promote retrofit as an energy efficiency?
Well, I'm running a series of events over the summer, which I think your colleague Owen is coming to one of them, from a lighting control systems company who are 30th anniversary this year. And so we're doing one on retrofit, we're doing one on new buildings, we're doing one on sustainability. Hopefully, we'll be collaborating on a report around retrofit, and I'll be speaking to some companies there about trying to provide those different perspectives on that, whether it's process, whether it's technology, whether it's like, low hanging fruit, lessons learned, etc. What I would like to be doing is trying to, use all of these different things to try and work out a way of kickstarting some kind of industry collaboration between all these different organizations which kind of represent different stakeholder groups. So what is it that they can be doing collectively rather than individually on this area, particularly around retrofit, because as I say, that's 80% of all buildings, and with 75% of them not meeting energy standards, then there's clearly a lot of work which needs to be done. So that's next, I hope. Fingers crossed.
Good stuff. We'll look forward to it. Well, thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for listening as well.